like one. If you remember back 2 weeks ago when we started, we did sort of an intro lesson, and we sort of looked at it, and what I really want us to think of these three books is to start to think of them as the role of Timothy and Titus in what we sort of call the logistics of global gospel distribution. That a lot of what the first century church was trying to accomplish was getting the gospel message that Jesus left with the 12 apostles out to, as he says in the Great Commission, every person on the planet. And how hard that would be, and certainly impossible to do through the work of just 12 men. And so they would have to bring in other people to help them, to assist them, to, if they were planting, as it says in 1 Corinthians chapter 3 at verse 6, there would be other people who would need to water in different locations where the word had been initially spread, perhaps by the apostles or others. And so the role of Timothy and Titus in the locations where they're being sent in these three letters, Timothy to Ephesus and Titus to the island of Crete, was more much that role of watering. And we want to sort of think of them in that role of watering those particular sorts of congregations. And at the end of last week's class, or 2 weeks ago's class, we were sort of narrowing down to the issue or to the question of, well, if you were in a position of someone like Paul, who's the one who wrote all of three of the letters that we're talking about in this class, how would you decide? How would you decide which of your assistants, these people who are working with you, as it were, would go to which particular location where the watering needed to take place? Why is it, in essence, we're asking, that Timothy was the right person for the job in Ephesus and that Titus was the right person for the role in Crete? Now, it was mentioned to me after the last class, and I think this is very important. Let's turn over to Acts chapter 13. Acts chapter 13, the first couple of verses, and start to see that one of the things that are going on here is that in making these decisions as to who goes where and where people are best allocated, how to manage these resources and distributing the gospel to different places, is that it's not necessarily all Paul's decision, right? A lot of the decision here is actually the active work of the Holy Spirit. So in the congregation here at Antioch, just as an example, there were many prophets and teachers, and there's a list of them at the beginning of this chapter, of a man named Barnabas, and then Simeon called Niger, Lucius of Cyrene, and Manaen, all of these, and Saul. And so in the congregation there at Antioch, you had a long list of that group, prophets and teachers. And among that group, you would look at some of them and say they have very specific skill sets that you would think would be very desirable for different locations where you might want to go and spread the word. Like, for example, Lucius was from Cyrene, so he was from what I believe is modern-day Libya. So if you were looking to send someone in that direction, maybe you might appoint him for that job. Another one of these gentlemen, it says, actually grew up with or was associated with Herod the Tetrarch. So perhaps this person was a bit of a higher society person than the rest of the group. And so maybe if there was a location or a circumstance where you wanted to reach that type of audience, maybe that person would be more inclined for that location. But on this occasion, when they're setting out on what ultimately becomes missionary journey number one, how is it decided who is going to go where, or who is set aside for this particular task? Verse 2 tells us. Who decides? The Holy Spirit. The Holy Spirit says, set aside for me Saul and Barnabas for the task that I have decided for them. And so when we're thinking about this task, well, how do you decide? How do you manage your resources? Of course, in this era, a big part of that process was the direct intervention of the Holy Spirit in the work that was taking place. And so we sort of see, though, that there are occasions, turning over to chapter 20, Acts chapter 20, where decisions would have to be made, where Paul was lucky enough to have a substantial number of assistants with him as he went from one location to the other, and decisions would have to be made as to how you would put these different people in different locations and use them to their highest and best use in the work of the church. So here in Acts chapter 20, down at about verse 4, Paul, after the incident in Ephesus, which again in this class we'll talk about in great detail in the weeks to come, but after the riot incidents in Ephesus in chapter 19, he meets up with a bunch of his associates in chapter 20 at verse 4, and it lists a bunch of them there. I won't try to go through all of those names, but he's got this group of workers that had accompanied him this far on this leg of missionary journey number 3. And decisions have to be made now that he's headed to a different location. So, well, what are you going to do with these guys? And you look at that list and you'll see one or two that you may recognize. There's Gaius from Derbe, Timothy, of course, who's important to us. But then you go down the list of some of these other names, and they may not may not seem like very important names. But with each of these gentlemen, some of them we get some detail in the Bible about where Paul sent them or where they ended up working, others we don't. But you look at the list here and you see that sometimes just circumstances of life would affect where they went and the kind of work they were allowed to do. Like take, for example, the one that's mentioned last there in verse 4, Trophimus. Trophimus was working for the Lord in a bunch of different locations, it appears, but his experience was ultimately limited because if we were to look over, for example, in 2 Timothy chapter 4, at verse 20, it says that he got sick. And so he got sick, and Paul had to leave him behind in Miletus. And so sometimes just circumstances affected what a person was able to do, where they got sent, and how effective they would be. But the next to last one in that list is also interesting, Tychicus, that is listed there at the middle of verse 4. It seems that Paul had a very specific use for this individual in the locations that he would go. You could look at passages in Ephesians chapter 6 at verse 21. And Colossians chapter 4 at verse 7. And to both of those congregations, this particular individual had a very specific role. Paul would send him to these congregations to tell those congregations that Paul was doing okay. Because during that era, they heard lots of things about all the hardships that Paul was going through and were probably worried for his safety and for the success of his gospel work wherever it is that he was going. And so it says when both of those locations, this individual was sent to report to those congregations about how things were going with Paul, that he was okay physically, that he was working hard, and that the work was being at least somewhat successful in the places that he was going. We might say today you could replace that with an email or a text, but in that era, that was a very important role, and that was the man that was chosen to take it on. So the point just being, just as we start out here, these men had different roles to play. And Paul often had to decide how he was going to distribute these resources and these individuals to different locations to make their highest and best use. And so that leads us to the questions of the night, which is why Timothy for Ephesus and why Titus for Crete? Did they have some special skill or some special characteristic or attribute that made them especially competent or suited for the work they were going to do or the challenges they were going to face at those particular locations? Let me open it up here. What do we know about Ephesus that Timothy was about to walk into that may pose some sort of challenge for him? What was he walking into in Ephesus? A stable environment, an unstable environment? What challenges was he going to face there? Lots of idolatry. Okay, so false teachers and people who, and false gods. And we certainly know that's the case from Acts chapter 19. That's what was sort of the source of the disagreement between Paul and the artisans of that day. So there was certainly a bit of that. What else?
What was going on with a lot of them, but contention between Jews and Greeks.
And that's a big piece of the puzzle. If you look at the book of Ephesus and Ephesians chapter 2 and Ephesians chapter 4, both get into that very specific issue of the interaction between the Greek Christians, or the Gentile Christians, and the Jewish Christians. And so that becomes a big important issue as well. Anything else?
He conformed to circumcision, which was the Jewish tradition. It was not a Greek tradition.
And so, and this is an important piece of the puzzle as it relates to Timothy and Titus. Timothy was circumcised, right? Paul caused that to take place in Acts chapter 16 verse 3 or 4 before he took him on missionary journey number 2. Was Titus circumcised? No. In fact, we're reading Galatians chapter 2 that it was specifically said there that he was not compelled to be circumcised. Now, what's the difference between those two situations?
One had a Jewish mother.
Why does that matter?
Well, it matters because normally the genealogy of the Jew is from the father.
they are a Jew after the birth of a Jewish woman as a child. Has nothing to do with Gentile one way or the other. So he was actually Jewish. The purpose of him being circumcised was so he could go through the temple without issues.
Okay, so it eliminated a potential hurdle to the work that he was being called to do, or that he was assisting Paul with as he was going from place to place during that missionary journey. Now, why wouldn't that also be the case with Titus?
For Paul, when he went to synagogues, and apparently that wasn't such an issue with the Greeks.
Okay, so really it was just a matter of, I don't know if expediency is the right word, but eliminating a potential barrier to the work that he was taking on in Timothy's case. And so it was not a necessity in Titus's case. And so you have that distinction in those two situations. Yeah, go ahead.
Titus in Genesis 2, Galatians 2, you find out he's a Gentile.
Right.
And so Gentiles were not circumcised. So him being circumcised really would not have brought him any more precedence with the Jewish people.
And in light of the dispute in general among the early church about the issue of circumcision, if Paul had insisted that Titus be circumcised, would that create a problem or I would say, lack of consistency in relationship to the early church's doctrine about whether circumcision was necessary?
Certainly, because it would demand him to be a Jew first, and that wasn't the case. You didn't have to practice Judaism to become a Christian.
Right. And isn't that the entire point of the Acts 15 council and what took place from that point going forward? So there's a distinction there, but it's because they're differently situated and the circumstances are different, and the message that was being delivered there is ultimately different. So in light of what we sort of see that Timothy is walking into in Ephesus, did he have special skills or special attributes in him that made him especially qualified to walk into that circumstance and thrive? That's what we're trying to get at a little bit tonight. And we want to look at 3 or 4 of these. And let's start with one. And we just want to get this on the table because I don't particularly understand it. And I won't pretend to be able to explain it to you in detail. But we do want to at least acknowledge it. Turn to 1 Timothy chapter 1. Look at verse 18. 1 Timothy chapter 1 at verse 18. We see an element of this that is, a spiritual gift element to Timothy that Paul describes in a couple of ways in his letters to Timothy. He says it this way in verse 18, "Timothy, my son, I give you this instruction in keeping with the prophecies once made about you, so that by following them you might fight the good faith." So there had been prophecies about the role that Timothy was to have in the early church. Now, what were those prophecies?
Well, we don't know if there were any prophecies, but the ideal that most people think about when they look at this passage is what they're look at it as Timothy was recommended to Paul by the people there in his hometown.
Okay.
And he was recommended. And Paul has educated Timothy. And that's what a lot of people look at it as. That was the people says Timothy is knowledgeable in the scriptures. We see that in 2 Timothy chapter 1, where it talks about he's learned the scriptures from his grandmother and his mother. And then in chapter 3, verse 15, it says you've known scriptures since you were youth. He was exposed to the Old Testament and knew the Old Testament. And they say this here is the recommendations that he would be a good preacher.
Okay, so you don't necessarily read this to imply that there is some sort of a spiritual gift element to what's being described.
Because
Okay.
it says the laying on of the hands, and the laying on of the hands here would be everywhere they all see it.
Okay, let's turn the page because there's more of these here. Turn to chapter 4. Let's look at verse 14. 1 Timothy 4 at verse 14. Paul advises Timothy, saying, "Do not neglect your gift, which was given to you through a prophetic message when the body of elders laid their hands on you." And relates to this entire point, I'm going to borrow a phrase from my Sunday morning Bible class teacher and say, I got nothing for you, in the sense that I'm not entirely sure what this means. But let's add one more verse to this. Turn to 2 Timothy chapter 1 at verse 6. 2 Timothy chapter 1 at verse 6. Paul says, "For this reason I remind you to fan into flame the gift of God which is in you through the laying on of my hands." And so the gift of God was given to him through the laying on of Paul's hands. Now, does that mean just that he was taught the scriptures by Paul, or does it mean...
The section of verses in 1 Timothy, you know it's not talking about a miraculous gift, because it talks about the laying on hands of the elders.
Okay.
Most commentators in thinking about this actually thinking this is also what they think it means in the second letter, is that the elders gave Timothy a charge, more or less. We charge thee, we give you the responsibility to go out and teach. So most of them think it's not miraculous, but more or less it's a charge that the elders gave Timothy to go out and teach.
Okay.
And we see Paul actually continuing that as he instructs Timothy.
And so this idea, though, that there was this prophetic message, when we think of prophecy, what does that mean? In its purest sense, what is a prophecy?
Message from God.
Okay, so it's a prophet is just one delivering a message from God, right? So, and that means, does that mean that the elders here are delivering a message from God to Timothy about the role he is to play? Is that what we're thinking?
That's what we're looking at.
Okay. So I just put that out there to say that this is mentioned in both of these letters, that Paul is saying this to Timothy, that there is this going on, that the role he is playing, however it is that it's been conferred in whatever level it's on, whether it's just the human level or a higher level, that this is what God wants him to do, for lack of a better way of saying it. Yes, sir.
Jonah, I don't want to get too far off track. However, have you read any of the spiritual swords this month?
I haven't, no.
It is, I think it's dedicated to abortion primarily.
Okay.
And it gives an in-depth description of God's contact with before they're even conceived, that he knows them, that he has communicated with them. And we don't know the depth of God's communication when it comes to things like this. John is one of them. John the Baptist, that's one example. Christ himself, that is another example. And on and on and on. Jeremiah, same thing. God spoke to him even before he was conceived and told him what he wanted him to do. That's the prophecy we're talking about. Well, that's why he did it. He didn't want to do it, however, because the things that God had brought to his attention, he had to.
Okay.
I mean, it's just, like I said, I went too far.
So I understand the point, though, is that God's operating on a higher level in ways that perhaps we don't always understand.
He knows what he wants.
Right.
We
Okay.
don't know what he wants.
God's plan is in place, and that he's seeking it out in the way he goes. Another one of these sort of characteristics of Timothy that seemed to serve him well is that he was a man by the time he winds up getting the instruction to remain in Ephesus, turn over to 1 Timothy chapter 1, and we'll look at verse 3 in a second. By the time he gets that instruction, he's a man of a pretty substantial spiritual experience. And work in the ministry. He's got pretty substantial experience in ministry by the time he gets that instruction. So we really need to understand where in the New Testament story the book of 1 Timothy actually takes place. And so to look at that, let's just read verse 3. He says, "As I urged you when I went into Macedonia, stay there in Ephesus so that you may command certain men not to teach false doctrines any longer." So this is kind of the clue we get as to when in the New Testament story the book of 1 Timothy was written. So you may look at that and say, okay, well, that kind of seems like that could be during one of Paul's missionary journeys, right? He was always going from place to place, and he would send people from place to place. So maybe it was that one time during those missionary journeys we read about in Acts, Paul was in Macedonia, was in Ephesus and then left to go to Macedonia and said to Timothy, you stay here in Ephesus. Although that seems like that could be the case, it actually doesn't track Paul's missionary journeys that are recorded in Acts. Like, turn to Acts chapter 19 for a second, because this would be the one where if this was talking about one of the missionary journeys in Acts, it seems like this would be where it was. Because remember, what he says in 1 Timothy 1 at verse 3 is that I was in Ephesus, I left to go to Macedonia, and I say you remain here in Ephesus. Now here we are in Acts chapter 19, and we see in verse 1 that Paul was at that point in time in Ephesus. We also jump down to verse 22, and you'll see that Timothy at that time, or at least for a portion of the time, was also with Paul in Ephesus. So you've got both men in Ephesus at the same time. Now the next part of the story would have to be Paul leaving Ephesus and going to Macedonia. So again, read verse, 22. That's not the case. So it says that's Paul, sent 2 of his helpers, Timothy and Erastus, to Macedonia while he stayed in the province of Asia for a little while. And so Asia, which is where Ephesus was at that point in time. And so we've got Paul in Ephesus, staying in Ephesus, and sending Timothy to Macedonia. So this doesn't track. So this can't be the time period where 1 Timothy comes into play. So if that's not the case, then where does the book of 1 Timothy take place in the gospel narrative?
After chapter 28 in Acts.
Okay, good. So that seems to be the general consensus on this. So we've got the entirety of the book of Acts, which includes Paul's first, second, and third missionary journeys, and then his trials, his arrest and his trials, and ends in chapter 28 with his imprisonment, 2-year house imprisonment in Rome. And then after that, what happens? Well, we don't actually have the details of what happens at that point. Does Paul get out of jail or out of his home confinement in Rome?
He does for a short while, and he travels around, and that's when they believe that Timothy was left in Ephesus, when Paul was going around visiting the other churches that he had helped establish in different areas before his second imprisonment.
Okay, good. So understand that's how these pieces fit together. You've got the entire story of Paul that starts in Saul turns to Paul in Acts chapter 9, going through the end of Acts, with all those missionary journeys and the arrests and the trials and all those sorts of things. The house arrest that ends it has those 2 years house arrest in chapter 28. And afterwards, we don't get any more Bible accounts of what takes place. But the general consensus, because of secular history and other things that we have on the subject matter, suggests that Paul did in fact get out of that imprisonment and continue to do work for the Lord for some period of time before he was rearrested and ultimately put to death. And the idea being is that after his release from Rome and that first imprisonment that we have in Acts chapter 28, that would have been when he went to, as described in 1 Timothy chapter 1 at verse 3, to Ephesus, and then to Macedonia, leaving Timothy in Ephesus, and probably also the same thing, that he visited Crete and then left Crete and left Titus back in Crete. The point here being that this is pretty late in the game, as it were. It's pretty late in Paul's life, and it's after all the events that we have in Acts. So everything that you read about Timothy in the book of Acts has already happened before the events that are being described in 1 Timothy. That's the general consensus as to what's going on. So what has gone on in Timothy's life, in his ministry, working with Paul and others at this point? Let's go through it just in a little bit of detail here. So go back to Acts chapter 16. Acts chapter 16. First time we see Timothy with Paul is in Acts chapter 16, the first 4 verses. During the second missionary journey, simply shortly after the Jerusalem Council and the decision about that the Gentile Christians need not be circumcised, the letter is written to be delivered to these congregations, delivering that particular message. Paul and some of his traveling party began to take that letter to these congregations to inform them of that matter. And in chapter 16, he goes to the cities of Lystra and Iconium, and that's where he meets Timothy in Acts chapter 16 at verse 1. We get his background, Timothy's background there, and he is sort of drafted at that point by Paul to continue on with him and also go with him from place to place, delivering this letter about the circumcision issue. And so from that point forward, from time to time, the Acts is not a story of Titus or Timothy's life, so we don't know all of his movements, but we know some of them as are described in the book of Acts the remainder of the time. And so the very next verse, Acts chapter 16 at verse 5, we see that Timothy in his very first work with Paul was able to see just how fast a church can grow. So it says in chapter 16 at verse 5 that as they were delivering that letter, the decisions of the apostles and elders in Jerusalem, it says the churches were strengthened in faith and grew daily in numbers. Sort of suggests kind of exponential growth in these congregations as they're going from place to place. And Timothy was able to go along with Paul and see this. I think that's actually kind of important. I don't know that I've ever been part of a congregation that's grown exponentially in the way that these early congregations were growing that fast. And so he gets to see that kind of even on his first occasion of working with Paul there. Next time we see him is in the next chapter, Acts chapter 17 at verse 14. As this journey continues on, Timothy continues with Paul and is with him in the city of Berea. Now, he experiences something a little bit different in the city of Berea in the sense that he was able to see there the full spectrum of possible responses to the gospel message that Paul was delivering. What do we know and always say about the Bereans that Paul taught on this occasion? What do we always say about them? Okay, so they didn't just take the message at face value. They were always checking behind what Paul was saying to see if those things were so. They were of, relative to Thessalonica, where Paul had just come from, of more noble character. Acts chapter 17 and verse 11 says of them. And so Paul, with Timothy, got to see that. He got to see nobility in those who were growing in their spiritual knowledge and becoming strong as a result of that. But we see also in that same paragraph, keep reading there, it says in verse 13, when the Jews in Thessalonica, where Paul had just come from, had been run out of, learned that Paul was preaching the word of God at Berea, they went there too, agitating the crowds and stirring them up. And so as a result of that, it says in verse 14, Paul was sent away, and Titus and Silas stayed in Berea. So now he gets to see the other side of the coin. So he's seen exponential growth in these early churches in other cities. He's gotten to Berea and he has seen true nobility in those who were hearing Paul's message. All good things. But then as time continues on in Berea there, now he gets to see that it's not all going to be swell. Right? That these people had come all the way from Thessalonica just to cause trouble in Berea. I looked it up this afternoon. The distance between Thessalonica and Berea was about 45 miles. These people in Thessalonica were so angry about what Paul had done and what Paul was teaching, they were willing to walk, or however it is they traveled back then, 45 miles just to yell at the preacher. That would be like you and I walking from here to Gaffney just because we don't like their preacher. And so now we get Timothy getting a picture of the other side of the coin, right? How furious the message that they were delivering could actually make people. And he got to see both of those things in one city kind of in a very short period of time. And so he also got to see there, as we just read in verse 14 and 15, that as a result of this disruption by the Thessalonian Jews, as it were, that one, Paul didn't get to stay where he wanted to stay as long as he wanted to stay. right? He basically got run out of Berea because of this. And at the same time, as much as Timothy liked to travel with Paul and go wherever it is that Paul was going, that wasn't always going to be allowed or permissible or acceptable under the circumstances because of Paul's, I would say, notoriety among some of the people that he was going to. And so they ultimately separate here, with Paul going to one direction and Timothy and Silas staying behind in Berea. And so now he's starting to get some vital experience of being on his own. So in chapter 17 at verse 16, we see the very next place that Paul goes to is the city of Athens. And so that's his next big stop. And it seems that Timothy was not with him for most of, if not all, of that particular stop in Athens. Because if you hold your finger here and turn over to 1 Thessalonians chapter 3, 1 Thessalonians chapter 3, verses 1 and 2, you'll see that Paul says that while he was left in Athens, verse 2, we sent Timothy, who was our brother and God's fellow worker in spreading the gospel of Christ, to strengthen and encourage you in your faith. And so he says, while I was in Athens, Paul sent Timothy to Thessalonica to follow up with that congregation where Paul had spent just 3 weeks with them a bit earlier. And so now Timothy is getting sent out on his own, dispatched to a different place to check up on a congregation. So this is incredibly vital experience that he is now getting of taking on these assignments on his own. And this would happen in other locations as well. As it reads there in 1 Thessalonians chapter 3, look at verses 5 and 6. What was Timothy's task while he was in Thessalonica? Well, it says in verse 5, for this reason, when I could stand it no longer, I sent him to find out about your faith. I was afraid in some way the tempter might have tempted you, and our efforts might have been useless. And he says in verse 6, Timothy is back, and now he has his report. So Timothy got sent to Thessalonica to do what?
Make sure they didn't waver from the gospel, from the faith.
Okay, good. So basically to analyze how things are going there. And, I wonder, would you be able to walk into a congregation and say that is a well-functioning congregation or that is a dysfunctional congregation? How easy or hard do you think that actually is?
It's hard in one service.
Sorry?
It's hard in one service, however long he was there.
Yeah. So that's a skill, that's a challenge, right? I mean, maybe there are some things, maybe you can walk in and you see something that's like, whoa, that's definitely wrong. Or the dysfunction might be further under the surface, right? It might be harder to understand. And his responsibility there was sort of analyze how things were going there. He brings this report back in verse 6 and it says, but Timothy has now come to us from you and has brought good news about your faith and love and how you have pleasant memory for us and you long to see us. So he had a good report, but he had to analyze the situation and when he was there in sort of Thessalonica. But he's getting this vital experience being sent out on his own to take on this responsibility. And that would continue back in Acts chapter 18. Paul goes to Corinth, and Paul Timothy spends some time with Paul in his time in Corinth. But then most important for us, in Acts chapter 19, verse 22, which we already looked at a few minutes ago, we see that when Paul was in the city of Ephesus, Timothy was with him for a period of time there in Ephesus as well. And that's important. So because, again, for our purposes in 1 Timothy, Ephesus is the location of Timothy's work, where he's being sent to, where he's to remain and trying to build things up. He had been there before. And so 1 Timothy is not the first time that he had a responsibility for the things that take place in Ephesus. Interestingly, though, if you look at Acts 19, verse 22, you can see that he was there with Paul for part of the time that Paul was there. So for the things that took place in Ephesus for sort of the first half of Acts chapter 19, which includes some really amazing things, including the miracles that Paul was performing there, and including the sorcerers who were formerly sorcerers that said, we're not going to be sorcerers anymore, we're going to be Christians now. And they came and they burned up their sorcery books, right? And made a big show of all those sorts of things. And so it seems like that he was probably there with Paul for that. But then it says in verse 22, Paul sends him away. And then in verse 23, we get into the riot. So the big part of chapter 19, the riot that takes place in the middle of the city where they round up people and there's this big unrest, it seems like, or perhaps Timothy was not there for that part of the occasion. But he did see in going around with Paul from place to place that the ministry that Paul was taking on could be considered criminal in many people's eyes, right? That Paul was finding himself in legal jeopardy because of the work that he was doing. We see this in a couple of locations. We never get a particular statement by Luke in the book of Acts going forward from the time when Paul is arrested in Jerusalem through all of his trials. He never specifically says that Timothy was with him. But we do know from the first verse of the book of Philippians and Colossians and Philemon, the letters that Paul wrote when he was imprisoned in Rome, all of those letters, it says Paul with Timothy writing this letter. So it suggests perhaps that Timothy was with Paul for some period of his imprisonment in Rome. And so that just shows us that on the top of all the other things he'd seen with Paul's preaching and teaching and going from place to place, he also got to see that if you continue doing these sorts of things, it may not end well for you, at least physically speaking. And so all of these things Timothy has experienced in his ministry before we get to 1 Timothy chapter 1. And yet, despite all of that experience, look over at 1 Timothy chapter 4, and let's look at verse 12. 1 Timothy chapter 4 at verse 12. Timothy was, by this point, a man of substantial ministerial experience. And yet, Paul says to him in verse 12, "Don't let anyone look down on you because you are young, but set an example for the believers in speech, in life, in love, in faith, and purity." And so Paul still looks at him and says, you're still a youth, you're still a young guy. Well, is he young or is he experienced? Which is it? He's both. And that's kind of what makes him exceptional. Now, by the time he gets to 1 Timothy chapter 1, any ideas, any guesses about how old Timothy might have been? Might be a little low. Late 20s, early 30s, maybe? It's entirely possible.
I think the Jews counted. They were very young. I think they were about 30 years old before they actually were committed to a responsible man.
Most of them believe that Timothy, when the time of writing this letter, was around 45 years old.
Okay, that's a little older than the estimates I saw. But Paul's, would you consider someone, and this you can actually flatter some people in the room if you agree with us, would you consider a 45-year-old to be youthful or young?
Compared to an elder 60-something.
It's all relative, right?
Oh, he may be very old.
Yeah.
But I would think somebody in their 40s in that time period would probably be older, considered a mature, much more so than today.
Yeah.
Because their lifespan was much shorter than ours is.
Let's take it back to the other side of this. How old do you think perhaps Titus was in Acts chapter 16 when Paul drafts him to go off on missionary journey number 2? There are some estimates that he worked with Paul with around 15 years or so. If you take, let's say, 30, he was in his mid-30s by the time 1 Timothy comes along, that would put him early 20s or late teens, early 20s, somewhere. He was a young guy, certainly a very young guy at that point. I guess my question sort of more broadly is, how young is too young to give a person the type of responsibility that Timothy was getting at that age?
I don't think we can know that because we don't live in the circumstance. There are any number of times that we can look at our children and grandchildren and go, you'll know one day. But then our parents look at us and go, you'll know one day.
Right.
It's all relative. And back then, their lives were not like our lives. There are times when we're in Africa that you'll see a 3-year-old running down with a machete to cut. We would have a massive heart attack if we saw that in our children here. They're just different situations.
I just look at Timothy's example here and say, by the age that he has achieved, whatever that particular age is in 1 Timothy chapter 1, he has done more as a minister of the word of the Lord than I would imagine I'll do in my whole life. And he started that at whatever that age was, a very young age.
Well, look at Jesus. He was 12. He was in God.
Yeah, and so, yeah, we do have these exceptional cases. Jesus, of course, is an exceptional case, but I think, and I'm not comparing Timothy to Jesus, but he also seems to be an exceptional case in this respect. So when I use the phrase youthful experience, those aren't oxymoronic. I mean, you can put those two things together, but I just go to the point of saying that he seems to be very impressive in that respect, that he was a man of still relative youth, but with this massive amount of experience in the work that he had done by that point in his life.
You know, I think one of the lessons for us today from what we're talking about is, you know, all these associates of Paul, they came from very different cultural, religious, social, ethnic backgrounds, and at least Timothy and Titus had very different skill sets and very, very different personalities.
Different personalities.
And yet, they can be, or us today or them, they can be effective leaders and teachers with all the differences that they had.
Absolutely. There's not one particular way or one particular mindset or personality needed to be a successful leader. Yeah.
The ability to use experience and build on it is critical to being successful in this type of role, it seems to me.
Absolutely.
And Timothy had 20 or 30 years of experience by the time he was in this range, as opposed to some people who have 1 year of experience 20 times.
Right. That's an important distinction. Yes. And so his ability to use that experience and apply those skills in Ephesus is what made him such a good match, or part of what made him such a good match for the task that Paul had assigned him. One last one, since we are down to 2 minutes, about Timothy, and we probably won't get to Titus tonight. You could say of Timothy that he looked the part. What I mean by that is that there was some common bond between him and the congregation that he was dealing with there in Ephesus. Let's compare the profile of Timothy we get in Acts chapter 16 with the profile of what was going on there in Ephesus, and we've already sort of hinted at this. Acts chapter 16 tells us that Paul was half Jewish and half Greek, right? And then we made mention at the beginning of the class that if you look at Ephesians 2, verses 14 through 16, and then also in part of Ephesians chapter 4, you see that part of the struggle in Ephesus was about the interaction between Greek and Jewish Christians, Gentile and Jewish Christians. Do you think the fact that Timothy was half Gentile, half Jew, made him more effective in delivering that message?
Sure.
Why?
Yeah, it has a level of understanding and empathy for both sides. You don't have a pure Jew preaching to Greeks, and you don't have a pure Greek preaching to Jews. You have someone who can relate to both sides from experience.
And I think that's right. But I kind of want to put on both sides of the coin, because I could see someone saying, well, you know what? All Timothy is doing is delivering a message, right? It's not his message, it's God's message. And so all he's there to do is deliver it, right? So it doesn't matter who he is. All that matters is that he deliver the message correctly. Is that fair?
No, it's not.
Why not?
Think about what he just told them about these things. Don't let anybody look down on you because you're young. Because if you act like a person who isn't living wisely, they're not going to be able to accept your message. You got to remember he's single. In 2 Timothy chapter 2, 22, he says, flee youthful passions and desires. So if he doesn't watch out, he won't have their respect. No matter how much teaching he's had, if his life doesn't coincide with it.
So messages are less effective if they're delivered by someone whose circumstance doesn't match the audience. Is that fair? Was Jesus' message in Matthew chapter 5 about marriage less effective because he was unmarried?
I think that the person delivering the message has a possibility to influence those that hear the message. I mean, granted, what both Christ and, of course, Timothy both taught truth, but two people can deliver the truth and the audience may not be receptive to it depending on who's delivering it. You know what I'm saying?
One might have more credibility with the audience than the other.
Absolutely.
Paul talks about being like a chameleon. I'm all things to all people for the sake of the message. So if I need to share weak, I'll be weak. If I need to, he adapts so that a message can get through clearer, because when you're getting a message, people are going to receive something better when they feel like they can relate to that person. And so if you have relatable traits, the message gets through. Now, does it change the truth? No. Does it actually matter about the truth? No.
Should
But
there...
it does help get the message through if people feel like they can relate, and so you
But on
relate.
the flip side of that, we have Jesus who wasn't honored in his own town because they had known him too long. You have no credibility here.
Should there be male medical professors teaching gynecology? In Luke chapter 3, John the Baptist delivers messages to tax collectors and to soldiers. He tells soldiers what to do. Let's just assume, because it seems very likely, John the Baptist was not a soldier. Do you think he could effectively deliver a message to soldiers about what they should or should not do with their paychecks? Would that be a more effective message if it had been delivered by a soldier? All right, the bell is wrong.
I was just going to say, I think we're all around it. It's just as simple as the fact that with his background, he can establish a rapport and connect with a larger variety of people. He can make that connection because he has that common.
The rapport. That's a good word. And so you can establish a rapport with them a little bit better, and he was able to do that because of his background. We'll stop there. We'll pick up next week with talking about one word, the word minister. What does it mean to be a minister?